again, the ministers had to resign. When you're looking at this from an Indian perspective, given the kinds of corruption that we are used to, we end up having a very different take on it. But it's not just the same phenomenons, it's also the kinds of stories that we end up searching for and reporting on. If you're only looking at Western sources, you are likely to get a very different selection. May I have the next slide, please? Now, when I moved to Japan, I was aware of a shrine called the Yasukuni Shrine. Many stories had been written about it internationally because it was where war criminals, including Class A war criminals from the Second World War, were commemorated. But while I had heard a lot about this shrine, particularly in the China-Japan context, I had never heard about an individual called Radha Binod Pal, a Bengali jurist who is also commemorated at the shrine, along with soldiers who died in the battle. I thought that I would very quickly read an excerpt here from my forthcoming book, Orienting, which has to do with this Radha Binod Pal, this jurist. It's a fascinating chapter. And I think particularly younger people, like students today, are unaware of it. It really goes to show about how when you have an Indian lens, rather than a sort of general Western lens on a foreign country, these very different kinds of stories leap out. The most significant figure in the India-Japan relationship in the immediate post-war years was a Bengali jurist, Radha Binod Pal, whom I had never heard of before moving to Tokyo. In Japan, however, his name elicited the kind of reverence that other countries reserved for the likes of Mahatma Gandhi. Biographical miniseries about the judge had been aired on Japanese TV. Memorials to him were erected in Tokyo and Kyoto, and books debating his legacy were published every few years. I first stumbled upon Judge Pal during a visit to the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, an expansive complex of memorials and cherry tree-dotted grounds commemorating those who had died in the service of Imperial Japan between 1869 and 1947. I visited on a mid-spring day. Gusts of wind blew blossom petals to the ground into heaps of flowery snow, making for a tranquil scene that belied the bloody accusations that the shrine was at the center of. Yasukuni had emerged as an emblem of Japan's fraught relations with its neighboring countries, in particular China. Amongst the 2 million people buried there were 1,068 convicted war criminals, 14 of which were categorized as Class A criminals, found guilty of a special category of crimes against peace and humanity by the 11-member team of justices from allied countries that made up the 1946 Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Visits to Yasukuni by senior Japanese politicians were viewed by neighboring countries that had suffered Japanese military atrocities as provocations, tantamount to a denial of war crimes. But Japanese nationalists believed visits to be a justified exercise of sovereignty, indicating a moving on from what they considered was an overly apologetic stance to the war. Having reported on China-Japan hostilities for years, the shrine had loomed large in my imagination, and I walked about gingerly, somewhat nervous to be at the spot that had featured in so much cross-border invective. In the event, it was a pleasant morning. The blossoms were beautiful even as they waned. A series of memorials dedicated to military horses, pigeon carriers, and dogs charmed camera-wielding tourists. But the plaque that drew my attention featured a large black and white photograph of an Indian dressed in lawyer's robes, whom I discovered was Radha Binod Pal. A Japanese visitor gazed at the Pal Memorial, silently mouthing the words written on the plaque. When time shall have softened passion and prejudice, then justice, holding evenly her scales, will require much of past censure and praise to change places. Once I was back home, I immediately delved into this latest Bengali twist following both Bose's and Tagore in the Japan-India tale. Until the war, Pal was best known for his contributions to the Indian Income Tax Act of 1922, hardly the most riveting stuff, but his international profile came from his participation in and eventual descent from the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. 25 of Japan's top wartime leaders were convicted by the tribunal of this newly devised category of Class A charges, but going against the grain of Allied judgment, Pal had issued a 1,235-page dissent in which he rejected the creation of this Class A category as ex post facto law. He slammed the trials as the, quote, sham employment of legal process for the satisfaction of a thirst for revenge, and he argued that the nuclear incineration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki should also be counted as major war crimes. Although in the ensuing decades, Pal tended to be valorized by historical revisionists in Japan who sought to deny the country's wartime culpability, in fact, the jurist did not absolve Japan of wrongdoing. His intention was rather to highlight the flaws in the legal process of the trial, since all the judges were appointed by victor nations. The Indian believed the trial was biased and motivated by revenge. Next slide, please. Another quick example, people often you will find Western reporting on Japan, particularly travel reporting, to talk about the numerous Buddhist temples and the associated rituals in the country. I've seen stories about, how even pets get burials in Buddhist temples, etc. But rarely will you find a story about its Indian and extremely interesting Indian antecedents. Because early Buddhism was deeply entwined with Buddhism, and many Japanese schools of Buddhism, especially those influenced by Tantric thought, adopted Brahminic and Hindu devas, which they call ten, or gods. Some of these were co-opted in their existing form, while others became associated with particular bodhisattvas. The Hindu god Shiva, Daiji Zaiten, for example, was associated with Avalokitesvara or Canon, while Brahma, known as Bonten, was linked to Manjushri. Hindu deities were most commonly incorporated as guardian deities. Some, such as Indra, known as Taishakulten, and Varuna, known as Raijin, are common at temple entrances, including the very famous Sensoji, which is in Tokyo. Other common devas included Yamma, known as Ematen, Garuda, Karura, and Lakshmi, known as Kichijoten. Saraswati, or Benzaiten, is particularly popular and has hundreds of temples dedicated to her across the country. However, the journey of Buddhism over mountains and oceans from India via China to the Japanese archipelago has transformed many of these deities, both in their physical representations, how they look, as well as in their metaphysical meanings. And consequently, for the average Japanese, the Hindu underpinnings of the deities that they so often genuflect before at temples have more or less become invisible. Neither the names nor the appearances of the deities easily betray the origins to the uninitiated. I'm just not sure how much detail to go into over here. One very interesting story I did was on Matsuchiyama Shodan, which is actually a Ganesha temple located near the Sumida River in Tokyo. And according to some people, it's one of the oldest Ganesha temples outside India to exist that has continued with an unbroken history of Ganesha worship. In Japan, Ganesh is known as Kangiten, Shoten, or Vinayaka. And what I found very interesting was that the one big difference between the Indian Ganesha and the Japanese Ganesha is in his taste for food. And in Japan, he has lost his sweet tooth, and his favorite food is not the laddus that we associate with Ganesh, but daikon, which is a kind of mooli. It's a Japanese radish. It's a long white radish, which is quite bland actually in taste. And the myth is that if he is given daikon to propitiate him, then he removes all obstacles in the way of business problems and so on. And so all over the temple, you will see daikon sculptures, mooli sculptures and offerings instead of the laddus that we are used to. There were so many other stories in Japan that would have been of particular interest in India and were often given short shrift, in the sort of typical Western reportage. Given the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, for example, the one thing that really leapt out, of course, is cleanliness. Because if there is one thing that strikes people when they go to Japan, is this almost preternatural level of cleanliness. In my forthcoming book, I actually have an entire chapter on cleanliness, which is titled Zen and the Art of Toilet Maintenance. May I have the next slide, please? So again, a very quick excerpt focused on this cleanliness divide, which I think is of particular interest in India. I spent the next few days pondering the India-Japan cleanliness divide, which seemed to be one of the pivotal differences between my home country and country of residence. The centrality of cleanliness in Japanese metaphysics was evident from the language itself. Kirei meant clean, but also pretty, while fuketsu or unclean meant hideous. Kitanai is literally dirty, but it meant nasty, mean, and calculating. The cultural roots of this attitude were arguably located in Zen Buddhism. Until the emergence of public baths in the 17th century, nearly all the baths for common folk were provided by Buddhist temples. Shintoism emphasized ritual purification as well. But this identification of cleanliness and godliness was part of Hindu traditions and rituals too. Buddhism, after all, had Hindu ancestry. Muslims also washed before their prayers, and the phrase cleanliness is next to godliness was first recorded in a sermon by the Methodist preacher John Wesley in 1778. Beyond religion, a more satisfactory explanation lay in the early acculturation to cleanliness that took place in Japanese schools. The classrooms of all elementary schools in Japan were filled with rows of fresh-faced children. Jackets were slung on the backs of chairs. Textbooks were usually out. So far, so standard. But what differentiated these from other classrooms around the world was a hook under the tables from which dangled a cleaning rag or zokin, as you can see in the picture in the PowerPoint. Along with stationery and notebooks, this rag was an essential part of a child's school supplies that parents had to go and buy at the beginning of a term. So I decided to, can I have the next slide, please? I decided to visit one of these schools, arriving just in time for the lunch break. The 24 or so students in teacher Tanabe's grade 3 classroom packed away their books and pulled out lunch mats and chopsticks. A small group of about 5 children donned face masks, hairnets, and white coats. They left the room to return a few minutes later, rolling in a trolley laden with school lunches. The day's offerings included miso soup, fried chicken, a green vegetable mix, and bottles of milk. The children on duty for the day carefully served the lunches before eating their own food. Afterwards, they cleaned up the leftovers and took the trolley back to the kitchen space. The next 30 minutes were a flurry of activity as desks and chairs were pushed to the sides. It was time to clean, the cleaning period. Clutching mops and cleaning rags, their zokin, the children fanned out across the hallways, stairways, classrooms, and to the water coolers. Some of them zipped about in a kneeling position, hands placed on the floor over a cleaning cloth, elbows locked straight and hips wiggling high in the air. Others worked earnestly, meticulously, scrubbing away at stubborn stains. A few goofed off, turning the session into a competition over who could clean faster. Cleaning activities were formally mentioned in the Japanese government's educational guidelines, but some discretion was granted to individual schools in their implementation. In the Kichijoji school, for example, the children didn't clean toilets, although some Japanese schools made that mandatory too and dispensed with janitors altogether. For school children, daily cleaning lessons encapsulated lessons that went beyond simple hygiene. Teacher Tanabe elaborated on these: working for others, working together, and working seriously. It helped equip children with basic life skills and instilled in them a collaborative spirit. This was as much a part of education as learning multiplication tables. The result, cleaning was not seen as a punishment, and it was not seen as beneath anyone's dignity. It was not seen as dirty, but as the means to be clean. Increasingly, it became clear to me that despite all the logical reasons and obvious synergies that would bring India and Japan closer together, and despite their rich historical and civilizational connections, there was a very big cultural divide between India and Japan as we stand today. The cleanliness divide I've just mentioned, and now we come to what I call the Jugaad-Shokunin dichotomy. Next slide, please. Indian solutions are all about finding the loophole, patching the tear. But in Japan, this approach is considered unprofessional. After all, Japan is famous for its shokunin spirit. What is this shokunin spirit? Shokunin is usually is usually used to refer to artisans, different kinds of artisans who work with their hands, in particular master chefs, master craftsmen, master painters of different kinds. And it refers to the relentless pursuit of perfection through the honing of a single craft over a long period of time through repetition. It is, for example, the sushi chef apprentice who has trained maybe for 10 years before even being allowed to cut the fish. It is the sake brewer who at night only dreams of yeast. There is no space in his or her imagination, even at night, to think of other things, because there's this complete dedication to a single cause, profession, ideal of perfection. When Katsushika Hokusai, the iconic woodblock print master of celebrated works like The Great Wave of Kanagawa, was on his deathbed, he was almost 90 years old, and he'd been working for decades as an extremely celebrated artist. He is supposed to have said on his deathbed, if only heaven would give me another 10 years or even 5, then perhaps I could become a real painter. I was reminded of this when I watched David Gelb's 2011 documentary about sushi chef Jiro Ono, the very famous sushi chef. And the name of the documentary was Jiro Dreams of Sushi. Jiro, the chef, was really a shokunin personified. And it was astonishing to me, a revelation in the documentary, that he said that he had been massaging octopus, which is a delicacy in Japan. He'd been massaging the octopus for 30 minutes by hand before cutting it for decades to serve the perfect octopus sushi. But at 86, he suddenly had an epiphany. He had a realization. And what was that realization? That if you massage the octopus for 10 more minutes, so for 40 minutes, not 30, it became even better. And so the 86-year-old Jiro began to massage his octopus for 40 minutes. The thing was that the shokunin was genuinely humble, aware that perfection was inevitably elusive, yet never giving up on its quest. Aware that one lifetime may be inadequate to truly master a craft, but the shokunin kept trying and found the meaning of life in that attempt rather than in the ultimate goal. May I have the next slide, please? The shokunin spirit was, I suppose, not only the antithesis of the affliction that seems to have become the hashtag of our times, hashtag multitasking, but also of that most quintessential of Indian nanities, jugaad. What is jugaad? Jugaad is makeshift improvising. It's about making do. It's about the good enough. It is totally un-Japanese. May I have the next slide, please? This is the reason why, despite all the political goodwill and this sort of theoretical fit of demographics, of capital, infrastructure, political strategic alignments that I have talked about, Japanese businesses still find it difficult to work in India. May I have the next slide, please? According to JETRO, which is the Japan External Trade Organization, China received about 5 times more Japanese investment than India did between 96 and 2015. That's 116 billion US dollars compared to 24 billion US dollars for India. Japan-India two-way trade was at about 13.48 billion in 2017. Again, a fraction of the 350 billion China-Japan trade relationship that was the equivalent. In fact, the share of India-Japan trade in Japan's total trade basket was barely 1%. And it was just over 2% of India's trade with the rest of the world. And this gap cannot wholly be explained by the usual reasons, like inadequate infrastructure or complex tax regulations and the kind of land acquisition problems that all foreign companies and investors face in India. Of course, these remain substantial challenges, but other countries face these challenges as well. May I have the next slide, please? People that I spoke to say that it takes Japanese companies in India longer than their Korean or Chinese counterparts to learn how best to localize their products for the Indian market. I was given an example by the director of by a person who was a former director of JETRO in India. I was given the example of air conditioners. And what he said to me was that it was very difficult for Japanese companies to understand what the Indian consumer wanted, because they, in their mind, had this very fixed notion that the most important element will always be the quality of the air conditioner, so that it can last for years and years and years without the need for repairs. But as he said, in India, it is cheap to have an air conditioner repaired, and technicians are easily available, and the consumer was therefore more focused on the cost than the durability, on cost rather than perfection at all cost. Excuse the pun. The consumer was focused on Jugaad rather than Shokunin. Japanese manufacturer Daikin, which recently opened a second manufacturing facility in Rajasthan, is an example of a company that this gentleman gave me, who had eventually cottoned on to this idea and ended up, in order to become more successful in India, switched from importing expensive parts from Japan to sourcing them locally. But the process of this decision, of arriving at this decision, was a very painful one for them. It was not one that came very easily. The fact is that Japanese corporations remain strongly risk averse. And that makes it very hard for them to cope in the sort of freewheeling, jugaad, proud environment of India, where flexibility and impromptu decision-making are necessary skills in the business arsenal. The rest of the world is not necessarily like Japan. And therefore, many people do think that Japanese companies must adapt to other norms instead of expecting everyone else to adapt to Japanese norms, in this case, the Shokunin spirit. But you see, ultimately, the Shokunin spirit is a strength. It can also become a weakness for Japan. This is the fundamental Japanese dilemma, particularly as they look to go global. May I have the next slide, please? I want to conclude here because I would like to leave time to discuss some of these issues in the question and answer session. But I do want to say that it's been an enormous privilege for me to live in Tokyo and get to know more about Japan's history, culture, and society. I do believe that, difficulties aside, India and Japan can become closer partners in a range of different sectors going forward. And I hope that everyone gathered here today can help to bring some of this about in different ways, big and small, and that the India-Japan Center at IIM Nagpur is one such important step. So thank you very much. Arigato gozaimasu. I'm happy to take questions or to listen to comments, but please do keep both Oh, I'm not sure we can actually listen to comments because I believe it's all going to be in the chat box. Let me have a look over here. If there are any questions, could they be typed in the chat box? Because I can't see any questions at the moment.
Okay. Please open the questions for the speaker, Shruti.
Yes, sir, they are open now. Everybody can post in the chat box.
All of you, the participants, can please chat and send it to everyone so that everyone can see the questions, please.
Rahul, before we can maybe wait for 2 or 3 minutes while some more questions come in. Before that, I would like to maybe have your reaction to some of the things I talked about. I am aware that you have spent some time in Japan. Am I right?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
And what did you think?
In fact, Pallavi, it concurs with the talk that Rakuten requested me to deliver at their headquarters. And in fact, they were very much interested in knowing about the Jugaad method because they have their operations in Bangalore and they are kind of delving into how to connect the two very disparate cultures. So, for example, in Japanese corporations, and I tell my students often that the morning meeting is of paramount importance, that you come at that designated time, the CEO addresses, and it's like mechanized, and everybody goes about their business. But somehow, for us, we don't respect that amount of punctuality. But nevertheless, we never complain when we have to stay back in office for let's say 12 hours or so. So Rakuten, for example, is one of those organizations that you will know is trying to have a multilingual kind of a multicultural environment. If you go to their Crimson House, you will find Indians, Pakistanis, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, everybody around. So they're kind of delving into such kind of things, and in fact we had an initial dialogue with Rakuten to, if, as I am Nagpur, we could contribute to their. So your talk is absolutely in line with what the Japanese counterpart interested in India is also speaking about. But to round up, what I'm saying is that I do not think there is anything innately Japanese as far as, or Indian as far as discipline is concerned. So discipline should be discipline for discipline's sake. So if it is at 3 o'clock, we should start at 3 o'clock. So that's my personal philosophy.
Thank you for that. Just two quick responses. One is about the discipline and the punctuality. I have a hilarious anecdote based on that. And this is when I was doing a story about the bullet train. This was just post the deal that had been signed between India and Japan about the Japanese investment in the bullet train. And I had gone to interview the director of railways in charge of the Shinkansen, the bullet train. And he was telling me about how they were planning on implementing it in India. And I asked about this question of cultural differences. I said, well, it's all very well, the technical aspects, but there's also a lot of cultural differences in India and Japan. And do you really think that a bullet train can, given Indian culture, operate with the kind of safety levels that we have seen in Japan, where there's never been an accident or any lives lost as a result? And, he thought about it and he said, yes, it's true. We have all these Indian engineers who come to Japan for training. And I noticed in the beginning that whenever they would come, they were quite late. But after 2 weeks in Japan, they were on time. And I just love that statement. I thought it should be a hashtag of our times. 2 weeks in Japan, a solution to everybody's problems.
Yeah.
And also Rakuten. I was interested in your mention of Rakuten because that is a particularly interesting company in the Japanese context, given its emphasis on trying to go global and trying to be different to the other Japanese contexts. And it's done that very much by looking at English as key to making that change. And I think I can't remember how many years ago, it was perhaps 10 years ago or less, it overnight went into an English speaking company, despite the fact that none of the employees spoke English. I found this hilarious. I mean, so none of them spoke English, and they got an email from the CEO one day saying that from now on, we are all going to speak English, and I'm giving you 2 years to learn English. I will help you to take English classes, and you will all pass exams. And if after 2 years you have not passed your exam, certain standard, then you have to go and really enforce this. And 5 or 6 years down the line, it was actually a Japanese company based in Tokyo with a very, very global workforce and with English as the working language, which is something that most Japanese companies do not see as remotely possible. But Rakuten has shown that it is something that is possible. And it's really quite a fascinating example of that.
In fact, one of the co-founders, Seichu, and we had the chance, and our students also had the chance to interact with him. And he speaks decent English, and actually he speaks very good English. So he says that when we started and we embarked on this journey, I think within a year or so, he kind of learned the new language and became proficient in speaking that language. So it's remarkable. So the leadership is quite entrenched and putting its weight against this multinational orientation for the company.
So let's have a quick look at some of
Sure.
the questions. There's here one from Manishankar Aiyer saying, "Is the mess at Fukushima the outcome of Jugaad or Shokunin?" Obviously there was the lack of Jugaad in Japan was one of the problems, because what happens when you are not used to Jugaad or somehow averse to being flexible and impromptu is that when something happens that's not in the manual, when something happens that's out of the expected and requires an immediate response that is creative and out of the box, it becomes very difficult. And we saw some appalling consequences in Fukushima and in Japan, to the fact that they had not expected the nuclear reactor to go into meltdown, and that they had not expected the tsunami to be as far-reaching. There's a very sad book called it's by Richard Lloyd Perry. I've forgotten the exact title, which came out 2 years ago, about a school, elementary school in one of the villages that was about 2 or 3 kilometers inland from the coast. And it was a very good example of showing how the inability to do Jugaad and this kind of emphasis on rules that have supposedly been perfected caused a huge unmitigated disaster in the school, where every single child except for 2 who broke the rules ended up dying. And the reason was is that the rule book they were given was for what to do in the case of an earthquake, and they were never really given what to do in the case of a tsunami, because it was never expected that the floodwaters could reach so far in, like 3 kilometers away from the coast. And what they were told to do in the case of an earthquake is to go to a particular assembly point that is near the river, and to assemble over there. They had, I think, something like an hour and a half by the time before the earthquake actually happened, and they had to take a decision. And despite one middle school teacher repeatedly saying that there was tsunami warnings, because there were people who were driving by in jeeps fleeing the waters and saying a tsunami is coming, a tsunami is coming. And this middle school teacher kept saying that let's go up a hill. There was a hill right behind the school, but the school principal, the deputy, the principal was away, kept looking at the rule book, which had been sent down to them after numerous drills, and saying, no, the drill has told us that we have to go by the river. And in the end, he marched the entire school to the river. And of course, the tsunami had come into the river waters, and that's where they flooded. And there were only 2 children who actually broke ranks with the teachers and ran the opposite direction and ran up the hill. They were the only 2 who were saved from the entire school. Certainly, as I said earlier, the shokunin, which is very focused on a goal, and rather than on improvisation, is very focused on process rather than improvisation. The sushi chef who's learning how to cut perfectly is learning how to cut and cut and cut, but is not focused on cutting innovatively, just on cutting perfectly. It can be a great strength, but it can also be a weakness in times of emergency or the unexpected. Ghosts of the Tsunami by Richard Lloyd Perry. I just had somebody telling me the name of the book. It was called The Ghosts of the Tsunami. Okay, so My question, this is from Kosuke Noguchi, a director at Japan Foundation New Delhi office. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. My question is that during your 4 years in Japan, how did you survive in terms of the Japanese language? I think you caught up a lot since you mentioned few Japanese terms in your lecture. Yeah, though that was definitely challenging. Well, on the one hand, Japan has become much more foreigner friendly because it has been welcoming a huge number of tourists in recent years, which have, I mean, this is pre-COVID, of course, which had been growing exponentially. And because Japan was supposed to be hosting the Olympic Games earlier this year. And as a result, at least navigating had become easier. You had English signs in the metros and for all public transport, and at information points, usually people could speak English. We also now have the development of AI. And so, you can always use Google Translate, which is not satisfactory, but it's possible to get around. And I took Japanese classes for 2.5 years, my first 2.5 years. I have to say that I did find it exceedingly difficult. And this is from somebody who does speak Chinese. I learned Chinese in my 20s, but Japanese has 3 scripts, so in addition to all the kanji, you have to also learn the hiragana, repeat it all for katakana. And perhaps it is also my advancing years that I found that things wouldn't go into my head as well as they should. But again, I find just the Japanese language, again, it's something that doesn't really work very well with improvisation or jugad. I kept asking my Japanese teacher for like shortcuts and hacks, on how to learn how to say something more easily, even if it was not grammatically perfect. But my Japanese teacher was very loath to do this. She would always want me to learn everything, including all the grammar, very well and very perfect. And I think part of it was because she thought she would not be doing her job otherwise. She would be ashamed of being my teacher if she taught me bad Japanese, without understanding that I didn't need very good Japanese. I just needed functional Japanese that could get me understood. So I kind of found this quest for perfection running up against the sort of practicalities of just being understood, even if it's very broken, even in the context of taking Japanese classes, which was something that was missing in China. In China, my teachers were very willing to teach me quick fixes so that I might sound uneducated. I might not sound like somebody who can speak literary Chinese, but that was not my goal. And I found that the understanding of that what my goal was easier to put across in China than it was in Japan. Okay, so we have another 7 minutes. You mentioned about the difficulties Japanese businesses have while adapting to India. Could you shed some light on difficulties Indian companies face when getting into Japan? Well, just getting into Japan will be difficult, just getting a foot in. I mean, we've touched upon linguistic issues earlier. I think this is a huge challenge, despite, many years of exposure to the world. Japan has been integrated with the global economy for decades, but it still remains very Japanese in its outlook. And there still seems to be a mindset, which is that the world has to become Japanese to deal with Japan, rather than Japanese companies need to go global to deal with the rest of the world. And of course, this is changing. We've talked about Rakuten, for example, but it's not the norm. And a lot of Indian companies find that that's an obstacle to even get people to agree to talk to them. The reputation of Indian companies is not always sterling. We have not been done any favors by, for example, the whole Rambaxi debacle that happened earlier. So that, India continues to have a negative reputation in many ways. And then the linguistic problems continue to pose quite a big challenge as well. Okay. Thanks for your talk. You threw light on concepts we can learn from the Japanese. During your time in Japan, what aspect of the Indian way helped you in navigating the landscape? What are a few of these, other than improvising and jugaad, that stood out as something that was a definite advantage? So improvising and jugaad is not something that the Japanese would be very excited about. So that was not an advantage. I think improvising and jugaad jugaad is a definite no-no. Following the rules is something that will stand you in better stead. But there were other aspects, I think, of being Indian that help. I think there is a genuine interest in Indian culture because of the Buddhist connection. It's an old sort of cliched connection, but I mean, religion does go to the heart of how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. And so many of the kind of unconscious gestures that we have in how we relate to each other are the same. Even the gesture of bowing, we bow, we might do it with a namaste, but it comes very naturally to us to interact with people like that. We also have hierarchical constructs in our culture. We also have very strong filial ties and familial ties. So I think a lot of the kind of softer aspects of politeness, of how we, hospitality, of how we just deal with each other in a possibly less than very direct way, which is very Western, it can be quite helpful as an Indian. And certainly there is no hostility. There are no kind of nasty stereotypes that you often have of Indians in other parts of the world. In Japan, at least on the cultural level, the perception of India is quite positive in the cultural sphere. Okay. The Delhi metro was financed by Japan to a large extent, and having been involved in some metro stations' design, it was pleasantly surprising to see it being run like clockwork, literally, with a countdown timer in the DMRC offices, which operations were run strictly along. Obviously, Japanese influence. Great talk, Pallavi. Enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you very much. I think that's really more of a comment, but I do think that the Delhi Metro is an excellent example that shows that despite the Jugaad-Shokunin dichotomy, that there is a bridge that's possible, and that, to the benefit of both, from India learning a little bit more of the Shokunin spirit, and the Japanese getting a little bit more flexibility and the Jugaad spirit. And I really think that moving a bit closer to each other, looking at the dichotomy, building a kind of bridge between these two is to the benefit of both. So I think we have 2 more minutes left. Should I take one more question, Rahul, or do you want to wrap up now?
No, please go ahead. We are all ears.
Okay. Japan has given us soft loans, and we have steadily progressed in the look east policy. In the evolving scenarios of Chinese influence in South and Southeast Asia, how crucial will the diplomatic ties of India and Japan be? They will be very crucial. Japan is a heavyweight in many ways, but it lacks strategic heft. And partly this is because of its self-imposed restrictions post the Second World War. It sort of tied its own hands when it comes to projecting military power or hard power, choosing to ally itself with the US and let the US do that for it. So while it is an economic power, it does not really have strategic heft. India, continues to struggle with its economy and is a developing country, but because of its size, it has a certain influence and strategic heft, which means that when the two of them, when you're talking about India and Japan, it becomes a much more powerful proposition than either one or the other country. And then also, of course, you have multilateral groupings like the Quad that I had mentioned, which would also include the United States and Australia. The diplomatic ties are crucial in determining the sort of geostrategic contours of the world going forward. But as I mentioned, they're not enough to kind of make a huge difference to the economic relationship, because while political goodwill might be there, and while it might make a lot of sense for us to sort of strategically cooperate, that does not automatically transform or translate into more business, more investment. That's a sort of parallel track, and so we cannot just rely on strategic and political convergence to translate into greater economic connections. So we're at 12:30. If you don't mind, Rahul, I would like to wrap up with this.
Sure. Pallavi, thank you very much for this very interesting and thought-provoking talk, and I hope this is just the beginning in our long way of collaboration. Thank you for taking the time out. And we have a small valediction led by your student. And at the end of everything, we hope the cherry blossoms bloom amongst the lotuses. Okay. Vishal, please go ahead with the valediction.
Thank you, Ms. Pallavi. It was
Your microphone closer to your mouth, please.
Yeah, it was indeed a very engaging Q&A. Now, before we conclude the session, I would like to share some key takeaways from the session today. Ms. Pallavi talked about the political and economical relationship shared by Japan and India, making the two countries a natural fit for each other. Further, we also discussed about the same phenomena can have different perspectives owing to the cultural differences. The difference between the Indian Jugaad and Japanese Shokunin was another key takeaway, which further took us to the discussion about the current gaps that exist between the two countries. Finally, the learnings that we take from the session has not only given a fresh perspective to us about the Japanese culture, but will also go a long way in shaping our thought process further. On behalf of everyone here at IJRC and I am Nagpur, I would like to thank Ms. Pallavi Aiyer for taking out her time and sharing knowledge and experience with all of us. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the team behind the event, Ms. Bharti from the IT office, Mr. Neeraj from the graphics and communication department of IIM Nagpur, Professor Gunjan Tomar, Chairperson IT Services for her help and support. Further, the student coordination team, Fareed, Premal, Pratyaksh, Shruti, Avinandan, Sampath, and Madhumita for working on this event. And finally, thanks to everyone who joined in today from around the globe, making this event a great success. With this, we are okay now to conclude the session. Take care, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you.